Now we're back in the dangerous situation of, if North Korea does go ahead with the satellite launch, then a lot of this falls apart very quickly.
This is Mike Lee News, a conversation with Washington-based Korea analyst Jenny Town. She's managing editor of 38 North, the web journal that published these commercial satellite photos, which reportedly show that North Korea has already rebuilt its Sohae satellite test and launch site. I asked Jenny Town to explain where we now stand in efforts to prevent an escalation of the nuclear arms tension between North Korea and the United States.
Well, I think the inability to get a deal out of Hanoi really deflated the diplomatic process. There was a pretty high expectation that we were very close to a deal, that we should have been able to get something very interim as sort of preliminary steps to start working on while we figure out the rest of the story. It's disappointing to know how far away we were from agreement on key issues that held up this potential interim deal. And while both sides were very careful to leave the door open for future diplomacy and characterize this in a very positive way, and with the intention to keep negotiating, it's very difficult to see how we maintain that momentum past this setback, especially now that you have some of these signals coming out post-summit of North Korea restarting, reversing one of its unilateral measures and rebuilding the facilities at the Sohae satellite launching station, the launch pad and the engine test stand. And you hear Congress, and you hear Bolton, and you hear other people in the administration already talking about imposing new sanctions on North Korea. This is all sending us, in a downward spiral here. And if we don't get back to talks right away, it's going to be very difficult to get back to talks in the future.
You've used the words unexpected and disappointment, or implied that. What makes you think that there was a deal to be made that fell through? I mean, what information did you have? Because we don't know, as I understand it, what the decision makers inside either government really knew or planned to know or were planning on. So on what basis can you say that a big deal, was expected?
Well, I wouldn't say a big deal. A little deal was expected. And I think there were very positive signs coming from the Trump administration and coming from Ambassador Began, especially in the speech that he gave at Stanford a couple weeks before the summit, where he did lay out some specifics of things that they had discussed. And you would assume that they would only say these publicly if there was a very good understanding that they were likely to happen, or had been at least received well. I think there were signs, there were some talk, there were some leaks coming out of some very preliminary steps that were very reasonable steps, nothing too dramatic, but were certainly implementable, and especially implementable in a short time frame. That it did sound like they were planning to move forward with it, as well as the idea of the schedule itself had already penciled in a signing ceremony for a deal. I think there were some leaks that said that the deal was basically 3/4 of the way penned, and it was just waiting for the conclusion, and that they were still working out some last minute details. What it sounds like from the reporting, and it's been hard to piece together the full story, is that once the two sides got to Hanoi for the last round of pre-summit negotiations, this is where one side or the other, or both sides, started to up the ante to see what more they could get in this preliminary deal. And I think that's when things really started to fall apart.
Do you have what you feel is a confident understanding of what happened there in terms of what you might say went wrong, although some people might say it went right?
I think we have a pretty good readout of the higher demands that were asked. It's still very unclear the actual sequencing of who went first in like I said, in trying to up the ante. Some accounts are, that the North Koreans had upped the ante first. There's some accounts that they might have actually even indicated this before they got to Hanoi, in which case, again, it is a bit unfortunate that they didn't postpone the summit to be able to work out these details.
There was some talk, I think, in one of your discussions at your organization that Kim had parked one of his locomotives for a
Yeah.
train in China, and the inference would have been that he planned to visit China after a successful summit. A big deal might have been signed. So there
Right.
again might be signs or indications that a deal might have indeed been in the offing.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, the Chinese were expecting a deal to be signed. The South Koreans were expecting a deal to be signed. I think a lot of us that have been, kind of keyed into this process expected a deal to be signed. So it was surprising how badly things fell apart. And like I said, and really disappointing because it really does set back the whole process now. One, it might help Trump look like a more tough negotiator, but at the same time, it also means there's nothing in place at the moment. There's no restrictions. There's no benchmarks. There's no indicators of, where we're going and how we're going to get there. And we're basically, the rhetoric is moving back towards square one of now we need to get everything because we can't trust even like little things, to be able to get even a small deal at this time.
Well, to put it in super simple terms, I suppose that you and a lot of experts were hoping for a give and take process, and now we're into an all or nothing process.
Well, we started with an all or nothing process, and we had started to get out of that mindset. And I think there had been a learning curve over the past, 7, 8 months from the administration and from the North Koreans as well as what won't work. Um, but then it sounds like when they got to Hanoi, they went back to, instead of, the policy had evolved, they were ready to talk about a more incremental approach and incremental agreement, start here with something and then work towards something more. And then, yeah, it sounds like at Hanoi, both sides, up the ante until we were back to that all or nothing approach that we know doesn't work to begin with.
Well, the flip side of thinking might be that maybe Trump's walkaway will, in the end, work better. Do you discount that completely?
I Again, seeing the reaction to what's happening, I'm not hopeful. I'm not optimistic. It's one thing to look like a tough negotiator, and that's the thing is that what the North Koreans were asking for on the sanctions side, from what we've been able to parse, was too big of an ask, especially for what they were willing to do. The question is could they have gotten to a more, a compromise over, instead of all of the sectoral, alleviating all of the sectoral sanctions in the 5 UN sanctions that they designated? Could we have done maybe like one sector, or something along those lines? I think if they had more time, they probably could have come to a compromise. But instead of trying to actually deal with that, then I feel like they started to, if they're betting, they started to call the bet and say, hey, you need to give us at least one more facility on the enrichment side. And then Trump went all in and said, well, why don't you just give us everything, and then we'll take off all the sanctions. And it's just, there's no trust here between our countries to begin with. And so that's an approach that the U.S. has tried before that has always failed to get us anything. And like I said, the rhetoric that's coming out of the administration now in the aftermath of this is veering back towards that approach, veering back towards we need to punish North Korea, we need to put more pressure on North Korea to get them to give us everything. And that's the fear, is that, yes, it makes him look like a better negotiator. He's not willing to fall for anything. But at the same time, it also looks like now we're more likely to get nothing.
So Trump is backing Kim into a corner, giving him little latitude. And do you think it's likely that he's going to have to send some kind of signal that to get things off center again?
Yeah, I think that the key here is, like I said, the longer it takes to get back to negotiations, the higher the cost is going to be for any kind of deal. Um, the North Koreans are not making it easier by restarting the rebuilding of the facilities at Sohae. Even though it was never codified in U.S. DPRK talks, it was codified in the inter-Korean talks, where in the Pyongyang declaration,
Can, can,
North Korea did commit to.
can you explain for our audience the inter-Korean talks briefly?
Yeah, so Moon Jae-in and Kim Jong-un have had now 3 rounds of summit meetings.
North and South meetings.
North Korea, South Korea, the inter-Korean negotiation process. And so of those, there's been 2 different declarations. The second one coming out of their summit meeting in Pyongyang in September. One of the provisions of that agreement was that North Korea was going to agree to permanently dismantle the launch pad and engine test stand at the Sohae satellite launching station. So now for North Korea to have restarted and rebuilt those 2 facilities, because they had started to dismantle them last year, for them to start to rebuild those facilities not only goes against, sort of a reversal of the unilateral confidence building measure that they had offered to America, but now is in direct violation of the agreement that was made in Pyongyang between the 2 Koreas. And so, I think this is, a signal to both the U.S. and South Korea that the North Koreans are very frustrated that they have done these things, several confidence building measures, several meetings between the 2 Koreas. They've done some military confidence building agreements and measures and implementation, and they've shown, they've consistency in their language about being willing to denuclearize and do all these things. And yet at the same time, the parts that they want the most in terms of economic cooperation with South Korea and sanctions relief from U.S., they've got nothing. And I think this is a clear sign that they're frustrated. And if people, if the U.S. and South Korea and the allies think that, they can get something for nothing from the North Koreans are saying, if you give us nothing, we're going to take back even the little bit that we said we would do.
Presumably, it would have been difficult for Kim to go back home after agreeing to Trump to go even further than he's gone, and he's already felt that he's gone too far, without those sanctions, at least something lifted in return.
Well, and I think, there were sanctions measures that had been talked about in the pre-summit process that could have helped both the U.S. DPRK and the inter-Korean process. So, some of the measures that they were talking about was, giving exemptions to South Korea to be able to actually start the inter-Korean economic cooperation on the big projects such as Kaesong or the Mount Kumgang Tourist Resort, the Kaesong Industrial Complex, and possibly the inter-Korean railroads. Those are the major projects that the South Koreans had proposed. So, there were some sanctions alleviation there. And again, I think, North Korea overplayed its hand in asking for the sectoral sanctions on top of that. Rather than saying, okay, let's get this in place, let's jumpstart both of these, negotiation processes, give us some space to keep negotiating and move forward. So it's really unfortunate. And now with this, with the rebuilding of the Sohae satellite launching facility, now we also run into the risk of if the launch pad is operational again, for instance. Will North Korea try and defy the international community and do another satellite launch, as they have in the past, with the justifying it as part of their space program and not part of the, not covered under the missile and nuclear test moratorium. And so this is what derailed the Leap Day deal back in 2012. This distinction between satellite launches and ballistic missiles. And when they'd given this up as a confidence building measure and said that they were going to dismantle the launch pad, it really closed that loophole and kind of helped see a path forward to be able to create the right space for diplomacy to take hold. Now we're back in the dangerous situation of, if North Korea does go ahead with the satellite launch, then a lot of this falls apart very quickly.
Does that not make it really vitally important for China to stay involved?
Oh, absolutely. I think it also has to factor into North Korea's calculations. Because right now, China-North Korea relations, they've been able to repair what they can. And China is a willing partner in this to support the diplomatic process. And in that, there's, political and economic benefits to having repaired that relationship. So, there is a resurgence of DPRK, China trade. There is, some education and training going on, and China's willing to help in order to help support a better and more stable political environment.
And of course, U.S.-China troubled relations plays into it as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Although both sides try to say it doesn't, that it's completely separate. But I think now, too, with North Korea, even if they're trying to send signals to the U.S. and South Korea, I think that they do have more at stake now than what they've had in the past. And so if they do a satellite launch, it not only, upsets the diplomatic process with U.S. and South Korea, but it also upsets the Chinese. And so whatever cooperation and whatever political, relations that they've been able to mend will dissolve very quickly. If they go ahead with the satellite launch, and then things start to backtrack into what we saw in 2017.
Which brings us to the Sohae facility, and you actually broke that story with your satellite photographs of that facility this week. Tell us about that.
So basically, the North Koreans had pledged to dismantle the engine test stand there. It's not the only engine test stand in North Korea, but it is the largest, and it's where they've been testing their large liquid fuel engines. And then also the launch pad, which is the launch pad that they've used for the last 3 satellite launches that they've attempted. And so this is their showcase space facility, satellite facility. They have a space center there. They've done, media tours there. They're very proud of it. They've built it up over the years. And so they had pledged to dismantle it. They started to dismantle it about August when the U.S. DPRK talks seemed to start to stall. That movement on the dismantlement also started to stall. And basically nothing had really been done between August of last year and then February of this year. And so just before the summit started, about a week before the summit started, then we started to see movement, a lot of activity, cars, vehicles coming into the site around February 16th. It looks like the construction had started around like the 18th or so. And it's been pretty rapid construction at this site to rebuild the facilities that they had started to dismantle.
But why, I'm sorry, Jenny, why would they do that before a summit? Wouldn't that endanger the summit in itself?
Well, it's a good question. It only endangers the summit if they really believed that they were getting something that they wanted. So I think it's maybe out of frustration, again, that they weren't getting what they wanted. It might have been their way of trying to put pressure on the situation. Pre-summit. And there are some signs too that there's some back and forth of the story as to there might have been earlier signs that they weren't going to get a deal. and they weren't going to get what they wanted on the sanctions side. So it's really hard to say, especially since it really wasn't detected until after the summit. So, we didn't really notice it until about March 2nd. And so it wasn't like, they might have, sometimes people are like, well, do they know we're watching? And it's like, of course they know that we're watching, but we hadn't been watching very closely because nothing had been happening.
Well,
So
when
we
you
really
say
weren't
not,
paying.
I'm sorry to interrupt. When you say not detected, do you mean not detected by you and your organization using
Right.
commercial satellites? Is there any world in which you can't imagine the military was watching that all along?
Yeah, no, I'm sure intelligence agencies and militaries, and I think the first reporting of it was actually a South Korean intelligence briefing to the South Korean National Assembly had noted that there was movement in this area and construction going on at the launch pad. On our side, I'm sure the U.S. government had probably noticed it, but kept it, quiet. No leaks had come out until after the summit had happened. Then it became more public knowledge, and then all of our open source resources, we had to go take a closer look.
From what I understand from what you said previously, that the two main elements of that site are launches and engine testing.
Mm-hmm.
So there are three possibilities. The North Koreans do nothing at that site in order not to provoke the U.S. They launch a satellite, which in itself is not a danger in terms of nuclear weapons because it's not a missile launch site, but for putting satellites into space, but still could be provocative. And the
Right.
third, and I use this as a relative term, might be to have another rocket engine test of that facility. Is that the way you see the possibilities? And do you come down and thinking that either one might happen?
Yeah, well, now any of that is possible. Like they could just be doing it to, again, put pressure on the situation. I think it's a huge miscalculation on their part as to what they think, how they think the U.S. is going to respond to that. But they could just be refurbishing it so that it's constantly there. It shows defiance of if, for instance, in the inter-Korean dialogue, if they're not going to live up to their end on the economic side, then North Korea doesn't have to live up to their end on this side, on the denuclearization side, and just leave it there as here's the looming possibility and also the kind of symbol of the failure of implementation on that side. If they do a satellite launch, obviously it's going to be very agitating. And then the question is if they do a satellite launch, would they use the same satellite launch vehicle that they've used in the past? So the last three launches have all used the Unha body, of which, because they've already done three launches of it, there's not much more to learn from that SLV that could be applicable to a military context, to missile context. And that's always why this becomes so controversial, these satellite launches versus missile launches, is that there is some similar technologies and there are some things, some diagnostics that you can learn that can have application to the military side. But what they've already used, they've basically maxed out the learning process. But if they come in if they do a satellite launch and use a newer satellite launch vehicle, a larger satellite launch vehicle, then they can get new information that could be applicable to an ICBM. So there are many variations of how upsetting and how provocative a satellite launch could be, depending on what it is they're testing or what it is they're launching and when they're doing it, how they do it.
But have these satellite launches actually put satellites into space, or are they a test of the satellite vehicle?
So the last one that they did, they were able to put a satellite into orbit. However, the satellite stopped working relatively soon after it was put into orbit, but they were successful in doing it.
Missiles, are they still capable, and do they have them ready to go to fire another test that is so provocative, has been so provocative in the past?
Oh yeah, they have not stopped. They have not stopped manufacturing missiles. They haven't. There's no agreement on the missile side for any kind of restrictions or any kind of limits on anything. So, they've chosen not to do more missile testing. They certainly have a lot more to learn by doing more missile testing, especially for their longer range missiles. The last ICBM model that they tested back in November of 2016, the Hwasong 15, the larger ICBM, they still didn't have. There still was not proof that, for instance, the reentry vehicle worked, and there's still a lot more that they need to test out if they want to have greater accuracy and reliability. So they have kind of stunted their technological development of their longer range missiles by doing this moratorium on missile testing. But there's been no agreement to stop manufacturing. There's been no agreement to stop, R&D in general. It's just the testing phase.
Didn't President Trump say that Kim promised him that there would be no more missile testing?
He did. Well, the moratorium on missile and nuclear testing, it seems to still be in effect. The question is always, does North Korea consider this to include satellite launches also?
What do you think would happen if they tested a motor, launched a satellite, or did another missile test? Three different results, probably. What's your analysis of those possibilities and reactions?
Well, obviously the least provocative would be the engine test. And it would be interesting, to see if they did an engine test and if it was a larger engine than what they've tested in the past, because these are indigenously built engines. And presumably, it would be concerning, but it wouldn't necessarily be worthy of UN sanctions and things like that. If they did either a satellite launch or a missile test, then it goes back to the UN Security Council. Both of these are banned under UN Security Council resolutions, are very provocative to the international community, and will really damage the political will that North Korea has been able to build up over the past year of diplomacy. And so I think it's really, North Korea does have something to lose this time by doing it. So it would be a big decision for them to go forward with it.
Would they also be risking a U.S. retaliatory attack? I mean, President Trump might feel that he would look pretty silly if he didn't respond directly if that were to happen.
You can't rule it out. But I highly doubt it, that it would go that far. I think the default response, of course, is going back to the UN Security Council, issuing more sanctions. The price of miscalculation, if you were to do a retaliatory strike, is just too high. And especially, I'm sure even if North Korea does this, that the South Koreans and President Moon would still be trying to voice restraint in response, however upsetting it would be and however disruptive it would be to the diplomatic process.
How important to Kim is the mindset of the North Korean elite surrounding him?
Well, he's not totally immune to it. But, at the end of the day, if he wants to do something, there's ways he can coerce that decision to be prevalent.
I'm not sure. Can you draw that out a bit? I mean, are you saying that even powerful elite in North Korea would still be afraid to criticize Kim or take him on politically?
Yeah, no, I think there might be, I'm sure there's some skepticism within the elites as to what's happening and why are we doing this? Why are we going down the denuclearization road since we suffered so much to get here? I'm sure there's people who are like, why can't we go faster down the denuclearization road? Like, I'm not, I don't think there is a monolithic view of the situation in North Korea. But Kim Jong-un is has to be aware that there are diverse views of this, that there are critics of this, but people aren't going to openly criticize him, and those who do are going to, at the end of the day, Kim Jong-un is a pretty brutal dictator and can make very decisive decisions and purge people pretty easily.
Jenny Town, thank you very much for your insights.
Great, thank you. It's my pleasure.
I've been speaking with Jenny Town, managing editor of 38 North, part of the Stimson.org organization, a policy research group based in Washington. If you'd like to find out more about some of the virtually unknown and virtually secret developments that pointed us toward this crisis over many decades, please check out my podcast called Korea, The History Story That Never Told You. If you're listening on podcast, you already know where to find it. If you're watching this on video, the podcast link is below the screen. I'm Mike Lee. Bye for now. The North Korea nuclear arms story. This has been a Mike Lee News Update.